In the decades following Reconstruction, the South systematically whittled away at the laws protecting the African Americans' rights. Southern whites ignored existing laws, then passed new Jim Crow laws that separated the races and forbade blacks from using schools, hotels, libraries, beaches, bathrooms, water fountains, the whole range of public life.
Segregation is simply the separation of the races. Generally, it is by the dominant group, the group that is in power. It can be based on the fact that they feel they are superior to one race, and it can assume really ludicrous proportions. In the United States, for instance, if you look at some of the old laws for segregation, there were laws that forbade blacks and whites who worked in the same building from looking out the same window. There were laws that said they could not use the same school books. But it was a very serious problem because after the Civil War, when blacks were freed, they weren't not given all the rights of citizenship. It was shortly after that that you have segregation beginning. And what segregation did was impose upon blacks who were already at the bottom.
To control their black neighbors, whites continued to use violence and intimidation, and the terror of choice was lynchings. In 1892, white vigilantes killed more than 200 people for crimes real or imagined. Campaigns to strip black men of their right to vote were completed that same decade. Federal courts also hindered African Americans by chipping away at their constitutional protections. In the 1880s, a federal court ruled that those doing the segregating did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as they provided equal accommodations and services for blacks. When the Supreme Court upheld this notion of separate but equal in the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896, segregation won constitutional sanction. In the coming decades, Southern states and municipalities would pass laws to create two societies, separate and unequal, that would remain on the books until the 1960s. Surveying the American racial landscape soon after the turn of the century, W.E.B. Du Bois would write,
"For this much all men know, despite compromise, war, and struggle, the Negro is not free. In the backwoods of the Gulf states, for miles and miles, he may not leave the plantation of his birth. In well nigh the whole rural South, the black farmers are peons, bound by law and custom to an economic slavery, from which the only escape is death or the penitentiary. In the most cultured sections and cities of the South, the Negroes are a segregated servile class with restricted rights and privileges. Before the courts, both in law and custom, they stand on a different and peculiar basis. Taxation without representation is the rule of their political life. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of race."
Reconstruction was perhaps the most democratic, most revolutionary period in American history, in that one of the things that Reconstruction did was give all men the right to vote without having to have property. And this was revolutionary and unique for American society at that time, because before the Civil War in the South, if you didn't have any property, you didn't vote, black or white. The second thing was that we got public education throughout the South as a result of Reconstruction. Then, of course, the third thing that occurs in the South during Reconstruction is that you get a new level of civil rights. So Reconstruction, and in my view, was one of the most democratic periods in American history. And it's just unfortunate that it only lasted from 1866 to 1877.
So it was a failed opportunity. If you could have had the political will in 1865 and 1866 to demand more of white Southerners, that they accept their defeat, and part of the acceptance of that defeat would be a willingness to grant to their citizens among them, black citizens, an opportunity to get ahead economically and political rights so they could protect economic opportunity. That didn't happen. One of the things that did happen that is extremely important later on were the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments, that in effect provided the constitutional groundwork for claims for full citizenship that would be made in the 20th century and most vigorously after World War II in the modern civil rights movement.
Swept up in a period of unprecedented expansion and economic growth, Americans following Reconstruction dismissed the fate of African Americans as a Southern problem, best handled by the people who lived there. Attention now turned to America's bright future, which lay in the mines and fields of the American West, in the teeming immigrant neighborhoods and factories of the nation's booming industrial cities.